Well, thank you very much. I think you have provided us one of the most illuminating theological exposition on the perspective, theological perspective towards the other, but using your inclusive and exclusivist paradigm. I think it's one of the most refreshing and informed exposition and discussion I've heard, and thank you very much for that. But there is, you see, there is perhaps just one other point that I want to make. You mentioned Fazlur Rahman. I think one of the points that he makes in a number of books, particularly in Islam and modernity, is that the if I can't exactly recall the word, the key message of the Quran is to create a just and ethically viable community on earth. If I'm not mistaken, that is exactly, that stuff will be the message. And I think that will also confirm or support the argument that you have said that the pluralism seems to be, at least Islam does not really deny the fact that the other people exist on this planet. In fact, the purpose of the Quran is to provide a framework for creating a just and ethically viable community. No, but I can't help but, I'm a sociologist, and I'm sure you're going to do a lot of sociology as part of your studies. The question is, I think it would be very difficult to argue with some of your exposition, the theological exposition. The question is, how do we actually explain the sociological reality in the world as you and I see it, the lived experience of humanity? And that is that there are Muslim perceptions of the others and others' perception of the Muslims. And I think one of the best source of that is probably from your own, from the United States. The Pew Research Institute actually provides a very elaborate research on this, how Muslim and other perceive each other. And if I can take the liberty of summarizing it, basically the conclusion that I draw from that research is that the moral polarization between the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world is increasing. The Muslim world sees it to be the representative of the moral, high moral values, whereas it sees the other not so. And the other sees Muslim world just in the opposite way. Now, I can give you, I'm sure you're probably aware of the research that the Pew Research Institute has done. The other point which I want to, and before we open up, and you may wish to address it, and maybe perhaps somebody else will want to do, the way I see the debate about the perception of the other, the Islamic perception of the other, I think you have touched on one aspect, that the Islamic perception of the other who are not Muslim. But what about Muslim perception of the other Muslims? I think one of the key problems in the world that we are facing is not really, it is of course Muslim, non-Muslim perception of Muslims and non-Muslim and Muslim perception of non-Muslims. But within Islam, there's a war going on. And that war is precisely on the very heart of the issue that you're addressing, except that it changes from not Islam and the others, but Islam, Muslim perception of the other Muslims. Now, I have a number of questions related to that, and I think, the sectarian conflict, what is going on in the Middle East. I mean, 60% of the Syrian population has been displaced. The treatment of the Shia regime after the American departure, and this treatment of the Sunnis, which has given rise to the ISIS, and the ISIS treatment of the others, particularly the Shia, who we call rejectionists. If you look at the statements of Baghdadi, it's precisely the most anti-Shia rhetoric that he has actually. And then you have within the Muslim countries whole range of sectarian conflict. Now, I don't want you to address that, but perhaps this is something in view of Other questions that are raised, perhaps we can take up. But I was just wanted to alert you. I couldn't help it as a sociologist because I study what people do.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the very core issue of the modern world. It is a crisis of Islam, which I think we have to which is now, I think, confronting us. And it probably, a scholar like yourself probably will be able to inform us, what your thoughts are. But I open it for before we go further. So we'll take Professor Mitra. We'll take number of questions, 3 people. So yourself, which one? Anybody else? Okay, go ahead. Sir.
It is a historic occasion for the Singapore audience because we don't often have people who can pull together the Theological Seminary of Com and the University of Southern California. And to preside over this, we have a chair who was born in Pakistan as a professor in Australia and a very senior fellow with us, and brings together the Muslim Non-Muslim Understanding Institute. I'll draw on the main point made by Professor Riaz Hassan to ask you 3 related questions. I deeply appreciate the distinction you're making between Islam with a small I and Islam with a large I. I think the same would apply to all religions. But you have also opened up the possibility of a shared sense of morality as another way of looking at Islam. So the theological question here would be, can Islam stand without the theory of revelation? Can it stand on the right of the sensory world? Can it become a complete sense of morality, ontologically speaking? The second question is that of Jihadi John, or if you go back a little, the issue of the Crusade and Inquisition. I'm sure if the Crusaders were asked why they were doing such terrible things, I'm sure they would have said they're doing it out of love. Because the world is full of perfections and imperfections, and it's the responsibility of the perfect to help the imperfect to become perfect, howsoever painful that process may be. So, the torturer itself is being tortured. Because of the torture he inflicts on the other. The issue here is, we have seen the same also in Marxism. We have theories of religion. Have we also got a theory of man, which would answer the question, why does ideology fail? It's not enough to say that ideology was perfect, man was not. I think we need to go further than that. The third related question would be an answer from Hinduism. Look, Hinduism also has the problem of perfection and imperfection, that God is one, but he manifests himself in 330 million forms. So how do we live with these 2 contradictory realities? There's a Hindu cop-out, is called unity in diversity. Now, since you work on exclusivism and inclusivism, have you also found an equivalent of unity and diversity as a theory?
Hi, my name is Anish Mishra. Alright, my first point I want to touch on Professor Riaz's last point regarding the sectarian issue in Islam. If you notice, the sectarian violence has been on the rise recently in countries like Pakistan. Every year there have been people who have been dying because of sectarian conflicts. And if you go back to the history of Islam, even the Prophet's grandson has been a victim of sectarian violence. One of his grandsons' head got chopped because of that. And if you look at Pakistan, the issue is quite bad. And then we ask then who is a Muslim then? If I have to put this in the words of Iqbal, he said, allow me to quote, he said, "You to Sayyid biho, Mirza biho, Afghan biho, batao ke tu Musliman biho." It means you are Sayyid, you are Afghan, you are Mirza, tell me, are you even Muslims? So that's my question on sectarian issue, and I want to know
Who is, just to clarify, the question is who is a Muslim?
That's one, and I want to know how can we use Islam to unite Muslims to reduce the sectarian conflict. And my second question is on the exclusive school of thought. Fine, we do label a category of people as non-Muslims, but how do we actually treat the non-Muslims? Do we just collect jizya for them and leave them alone, or is there further things that we do to them? Thank you.
Okay, I'll address, hopefully briefly address these, and then we can, if we have time, we'll try to get some more questions. Concerning Qazwini, one of the, let's maybe go backwards. You mentioned the idea of the unity and diversity that stems from Hinduism. I believe that some scholars have attempted to sort of form a similar theory. I know there are those, such as Sayyid Hussein Nasr, for instance, who belong to the perennial philosophy school, which essentially, sort of suggests the same thing, that there is this absolute unity, this one unity, ultimate reality, if you will, and that the differences, all of the differences, they lead to this one garden or one, summit, if you will. The summit is one, and the paths are many to this one summit. So this is one, it's been given a little bit of an Islamic twist, if you will, the perennial philosophy. This is one theory that I know is definitely out there. The other issue that you brought up is regarding the Crusaders and the Inquisition and doing this correcting out of love, if I recall. Where I do understand that position, where that's coming from. And in fact, I think earlier on in the talk I spoke of how sometimes the exclusivist position can have both ways. One is to consider people damned and treat them as damned. The other is to feel sorry for them and want to save them, if you will. However, when we do come to the Quran, I think we can make the argument that even in the case of the Prophet, who is, in the case of Islam, he's considered the representative of God and the model for any Muslim, the ultimate model for any Muslim. We find that time and time again, the Quran is reminding the Prophet that he has no control over people, that it is up to them to choose right, wrong, to choose whatever, and that his only job is to act as a form of guidance, to present the revelation and the guidance to them, and it is up to them to choose. He has no say over how people should choose or force them into choosing. And so this, although there isn't a sense of love, but this love, it's not manifested in a way where someone is forced to choose a specific tradition or to accept Islam or to believe in this or that. I think there is enough within the Quran and within the prophetic tradition, and historically speaking, there is enough evidence to suggest that there is no such concept of valid coercion into accepting the faith. And then even if we think about it a little bit rationally, we think about it, the idea, the Quran we find many times sort of emphasizes on this notion of sincerity in faith, of purity in faith, of devotion in faith. That requires, I believe, it requires conviction. And conviction can only come out from certainty, from pursuing something certainly, not when something, especially a concept that is within the heart, such as faith or belief, is imposed upon someone. Maybe in the outer, sphere, they may be able to apparently, pray, go to the mosque, observe hijab, apparently they look like Muslim, but the conviction is something that cannot be imposed on someone. And I think that's what the Quran is really looking for. It's looking for quality and conviction and sincerity. So I don't really see a place for this idea of forceful conversion out of love, or even the Quran. I mean, God, who we assume to love all of creation, God says, had He willed, He would have made you all believe. had God, and God is the source of love. So I think that argument can be made, I think. And then I believe your first question was regarding Islam being considered completely a structure of morality. Many have attempted to make this argument, I think. Many scholars have attempted to make this argument, and I think that there is, veracity, there is strength to such an argument. Although there is emphasis on these doctrines, we find that even with these doctrines, even with the acts of worship, various acts of worship that are pronounced in the Quran, that they're always coupled with a sense of morality. That, for instance, as an example, the 5 daily prayers, the Quran talks about how the 5 daily prayers, they have been instituted to allow one to avoid immorality and indecency. Fasting in the month of Ramadan, to encourage us to arrive at a state of taqwa, righteousness, goodness, right? The same with the Hajj, the Zakat, the charity. They're always intertwined with this idea of morality, with this idea of ethics. And so I think that a strong argument can be made for such a stance. That it's not just based on dogma and belief, but also based on shared morality. And even in verses that speak about faith, they're always coupled with this idea of doing good, of being moral. I think that argument can also be made. I hope that I was able to address your questions. As far as your questions, I think you had 2 questions. One is, who is a Muslim? I mean, if you look at the tradition basically tells us that the only belief system that is required for one to be legally considered a Muslim is profession or witnessing that there is one God and that Muhammad is the messenger of God. That's it. It's known as the kalima. La ilaha illallah, there is no God but one God. Muhammad is the messenger of God. Muhammad Rasulullah. Outside of that, there is a lot of room for debates. And classical and modern scholars have made a number of arguments as to, what constitutes faith, what is a rejection of faith. Al-Ghazali, in his Faisal al-Tafriqa, Ghazali is one of the most famed scholars in the Islamic tradition. He says that as long as one professes a belief in one God and believes in the prophecy and the revelation of the Prophet, and does not consider the Prophet to be a liar, then one remains within the fold of Islam. For him, rejecting or considering the Prophet Muhammad to be a liar would cause someone to be out of the fold of Islam. But I think that it's very, very expensive. Unfortunately, in today's world, we find that we have a very narrow, in many cases, we have a very narrow perception of who is Muslim and who is non-Muslim. And it has become increasingly popular to throw around excommunication. This person is kafir, this person is out of the fold of Islam, because that's the excuse that's given in order to eliminate this person. And so, I think that there's a lot of room for diversity within the Muslim tradition. And if we look at historically the development of Islam, we find there was a lot of diversity in theological understanding, the various theological schools. There was a lot of diversity in legal understanding, the multiple legal schools, the philosophical schools and whatnot. So there was always room for diversity. And I think that we have to really consider Islam to be much more expansive than just some very specific issues.
So is the problem with the Muslims or the problem with the theology? That things are not working
Well, see, the
out?
thing is, it's interesting, as I think, at least I attempted to make this argument briefly, is see that the theology is understood by the proponents of the theology, by human beings. The Quran is revealed to the Prophet reveals the Quran, the community understands the Quran. The Prophet explains verses of the Quran, but understanding and interpretation of the revelation is on the shoulders of the community. And so to come and to say, is there something wrong with the theology? Well, whose theology? how is it being understood? Who's interpreting the Quran? Who's interpreting the theology? And so I think it's important to understand that historically speaking, there were many theological schools that were very accepting and tolerant of others. It's become much more prominent, more in the more contemporary era, I think, that we've become much more narrow. In some cases, some schools, some groups have become much more narrow-minded, and rejecting groups and their theologies. So it's really us who understand. And finally, in regards to the treatment of non-Muslims, I always tell people this: in the example of the Prophet, peace be upon him, who is the representative of Islam, there is a great example in the way that he treated others around him. We do not find within the tradition that he was cruel to others. In fact, we find that he was very open-hearted, that he was very merciful and compassionate in his treatment of others. And so similarly, we are required, at least the way that I see the Quran, the Quranic message, to understand that there are some theological differences, there are some contradictions, but that should not preclude us from interacting with one another based on justice, based on goodness and whatnot. And these are values and principles that are encouraged in Islam. So,
we'll take another two questions.
Yes.
Okay, just one to yourself.
My question emanates from what Professor Hassan mentioned, the problem of Muslims with other Muslims. When we saw the topic, we felt that there was more than what you said. You said it so nicely, your points of view, that the damage which is happening to Islam's reputation by virtue of what is going on in the Middle East, the Muslim community does not seem to be doing enough to contain that damage. And that is where my question comes. How can we persuade or initiate the Muslim world to come and stop that damage, reduce that damage? Today, we read a news item a few months ago in Singapore. Small children in the school, the non-Muslim children are teasing the Muslim children and saying, you are a terrorist. And that, from there, where does it go? It emanates into a big issue, social issue, as we go along. So my question is, Muslim community, how people, learned people like yourselves, what can you do and what are you doing to persuade the Muslim community at large to contain this damage?
Thank you very much.
Go ahead. Here.
Hi, my name is Michelle. Just now you mentioned that there is no compulsion to convert to the faith, right? What about, because you also mentioned chapter 2, verse 256. What I'm asking is, in a Muslim and non-Muslim relationship, is there an implied rule whereby the non-Muslim has to convert to the Muslim faith if the two should get married?
Should we address these questions? Okay. So again, this issue of sectarianism that you brought up, you asked, are Muslim countries they're not doing enough to contain the damage? I would add that many of them are doing more than enough to increase the damage. What ends up happening, unfortunately, is many of these countries is the ideology, the teachings that have been taught in some of these Muslim majority countries are the source of much of the sectarianism that's happening now. If we look at the educational system in much of these countries, we find that from an early on, the religious training, the Islamic education, is one that teaches and it promotes sectarianism. It promotes a very intolerant view of the other, whether it is the non-Muslim other or the Muslim other. We find from a very, very early training. We find in the religious schools, this is there. We find this in the mosques. We find this even in the Friday prayers. Even today in the Holy Mosque in Mecca, in the Friday prayers during the Hajj season. I've heard this myself when I was there, and others have also heard that the preacher openly, speaks against the Shia or the Sufis or this or that, denouncing them, excommunicating them. So there is a large amount of intolerance that is coming out from the educational system and from the religious establishment in many of these communities. So as far as what the Muslim world can do, I don't have too much hope in the Muslim world in attempting to change things, but I do think that if they were to do one thing, I think the educational system has to be reformed. These books that and ideologies that promote intolerance and hatred of the other, they have to be scrapped, they have to be taken out. The educational system has to be reformed so that we can have a change in people's minds and in their attitudes. As for the non-Muslim world, I think the non-Muslim world has much greater potential of showing us how we can contain this problem of sectarianism and intolerance. I'll just give you one example. The school where I taught at, and I teach at, I'm a member of the faculty there, Bayan, Claremont. It's an Islamic graduate school. This Islamic graduate school is actually the first Islamic graduate school that has been established in the United States, accredited. First Islamic graduate school. There are undergraduate schools, but this is the first Islamic graduate school. And part of the beginning, the process of establishing this Islamic graduate school, which trains Muslim scholars, men and women, was that there would be a non-sectarian training, that the training would be inclusive of all Islamic traditions. And so part of that, and this was something that was emphasized in the establishment of the university. And so within the faculty you see a diversity of opinions, within the student body you see a diversity of opinions. Courses are taught. I myself have taught a course on Sunni-Shia relations and interfaith issues, where we've discussed many of these issues. So there are many organizations that come together, intrafaith organizations that come together. They stand against the sectarianism, they work against the sectarianism, they try to promote a culture of understanding and respect within the Muslim community. And I think that in communities that are religiously diverse and multicultural, Singapore is one, the United States, other parts of the world, these are great opportunities in societies for promoting intrafaith, intersectarian promotion and understanding. And I think it really it really falls on the shoulders of the community members and the Muslim population within these societies to work together in order to promote anti-sectarianism, in order to promote tolerance and understanding. So these are sort of my 2 cents.
Can I just, sir, please answer me the last question. Well, can you say a few words about the Amman Accord, which every Muslim country signed, saying that all these faiths, different sects of Islam, are fine and they should not follow each other, and they all should agree. Starts with Saudi Arabia signing it, and every country in the world has signed it, including Singapore. And they have broken that. That's what you see today. The Amman Accord should go back to where their signatures are there. The Saudi king and the chief imam. Every country has done that. That these are the 10 sects, and these are Islamic sects, and they are all permitted. Now what are they doing today? And this only happened, what date was the Amman Accord?
2004, I believe.
2004, right. And so there has been efforts, and they have broken it themselves, except Singapore. Our Minister Yaqub is also one of the signatories. The Malaysian Prime Minister Badawi was a signatory. And they've broken it in Malaysia too, with all these hudud laws, etc. So
Yeah.
that's the status.
Yes, absolutely. In regards to your question, very briefly, I think it's important to understand that Islamic law is not static. It is one that is dynamic, and it's always been dynamic. There has always been diversity of opinion when it comes to various aspects of Islamic law. And although, according to some legal schools or scholars within schools, they have suggested that marriage outside of the fold of Islam is not acceptable, there are others who have opinions that it is acceptable. And so it's just a legal issue that there is diversity of opinion on. Just like any other legal, and there's sort of a misconception that Islamic law is static. It is only one thing and nothing else, and it is only based on certain scriptural evidence or verses from the Quran. Or no, it's much more of a dynamic and complex process that is constantly changing and evolving. And so there are differences in opinion based on that. Some have argued that it is permissible for Muslims and non-Muslims to intermarry without the need to convert towards the faith.
So where do we
Can I?
No, I think we probably
clear. Some countries allow, and some countries by law you have to convert. But under Islam, as I believe and I have seen, it's not a must. But countries' legal systems, if they do not allow, like in Malaysia, you have to convert.
You probably have tested your patience and your scholarship, but I'm sure you will agree with me that we in 1.5 hours we can't really do justice to the enormous amount of scholarship that you have outlined for us. And thank you very much for that. I'm sure that, and I wish you all the very best in your graduate studies. Thank you for coming and sharing with us. And thank you very much for coming and raising the question. I think we have, for those who are not fasting, we have oh, yes, please stay right there. Before I forget, we always show our appreciation by giving a present. Ole. Please, I'd like to invite Professor Mitra to give this.
This is one of our rituals, and it's a secular ritual. We don't allow guests to leave empty-handed. So we have brought you a book. It's called Being Muslim in South Asia, Diversity and Daily Life.
Very nice. Thank you very much.
Thank you.